this was I was very interested in the previous DVD, Great Decisions. This is a presentation that was made for Rotary. They asked me to talk about the things I'd been doing in South Africa, the non-profits I'd been involved with, and how the situation evolved over the time I was there. So I was, here we go, it'll take me a while to orientate. So I was born in South Africa, in Cape Town, a year after the Afrikaner nationalists came into power and began that social engineering experiment that they called apartheid, which means separateness. And what I'm going to talk about is a little bit that leads up to what you were seeing in that earlier DVD, something more of the psychological environment, the things that happened to create the downfall of apartheid in the first place. But my father was very disturbed by the outcome of that particular election when the power was transferred to the nationalists, or Nats, as you heard someone refer to them. So he strongly opposed apartheid. And so before long, he moved us to Kenya, where we lived for a few years until the Mau Mau revolution broke out. And it became very unsafe for white people. And we had a little brush with one of the activists who was our gardener at the time. And this really spooked my mother, and she grabbed my brother and I and head off back down south. Eventually, we settled in Rhodesia. At the time, it wasn't as brutal as South Africa in its political structures. And so my father decided that that was a little bit more civilized place to live, not without its problems either. Here we remained. It was my childhood being raised here. Until I left school and went to Johannesburg and went to college, university there. And then after that, to many, I lived abroad for many years in England, and then back in South Africa, then back in England, then in America. And so people comment on my accent, but it's a real scrambled eggs accent. So don't expect South Africans to sound the same. So starting with Rhodesia, Rhodesia was a colony of Britain. It was colonial down to its toenails. I mean, you can get the feeling of it. Very kind of British imperial. There was a separateness, economic separateness, but as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't as brutally applied as in South Africa. For instance, in South Africa, you had to carry what was called a pass book. It was a book that allowed you to pass into certain areas or suburbs. If you were caught in the wrong suburb, you could be arrested and detained and all this sort of thing. In Rhodesia, there was no such thing. That you used the same buses, you used the same streets, and you weren't prohibited from visiting certain areas of your city as you were in South Africa. But nonetheless, there were distinct political and economic divisions. That's a visit by the young queen, and that pretty much speaks to that. And being raised in that kind of environment certainly has its impacts. By the time I was heading into adulthood, my allegiances were firmly set. And here, there's an interesting dynamic that happens in these kind of environments. You had to clearly decide who you were in relation to the environment you were in. To borrow from Elridge Cleaver, you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. There isn't a place in the middle. To carry on life as normal and think it was okay just to do your job and go home and mow your lawn and take care of your family, to think that that was enough in that kind of environment, that would be considered part of the problem. So the situation really called on you to have a response, an emotional, psychological, spiritual, if you like, response to what was happening around you. you had to make a choice, is the point. So many, including myself, when we finished our education, we left the country. It was pivoted on the idea that by staying and living in the country and living in the system, paying taxes, that was part of the problem. That, you know, how do you live in that environment, pay taxes into the system that's creating such social inequities? But you live in London, many expats moved to London, and they'd hang out together at the same pubs and would agonize over their choices. But eventually it was a bit like, you know, to take yourself out of the situation is not to give back all that privilege that you gained, all that education, all those opportunities that life gave you by being born into that part of the world, in that social grouping, that to take that all away and invest that somewhere else was also part of the problem. So eventually circumstances conspired, and I returned to South Africa some 6 years later, and in the years that followed, kind of got myself involved in what I felt was the important things to do in that environment. Amongst, this is Soweto, which you saw to some extent in that video earlier on. These are the shanty towns built out of tin and things like that. They still exist, as the video did show you. A lot of the houses in Soweto, though, are built of concrete block, breeze block, they call them there. I'm not sure what you call them. They're the hollow concrete blocks. They still are pretty rudimentary, but it is a solid structure. So amongst other projects, I'll just run through some of the nonprofit initiatives that I was involved with at the time. I founded the African Institute of Art. It's in Soweto. I conceived and developed this institution to be the first faculty in the urban areas to offer post-secondary education for Black artists. Most of the post-secondary institutions and universities were located out in the townships in rural areas because, of course, everyone knows students explore ideas and they become troublemakers, and they didn't want the troublemakers in the cities. So there was the social engineering. It was really thorough. It went through all layers of society. So most of the universities and colleges were in areas where students could be contained within that area and not spill out into the major economic centers. So this was the African Institute of Art was the first facility particularly addressing the Black artists in the Soweto environment. We partnered with the University of South Africa to achieve appropriate standards and accreditation. The AIA, as it was called, African Institute of Art, survived the apartheid years. It's still in operation today, as it's incorporated as a college campus, still in the same place in Funda, Soweto. In that highly fractious environment, its success depends on who is prepared to lend their credibility to your endeavor. So the composition of any new board is really important. Of particular note, I got 2 women pioneers of the struggle to join this fledgling board. The first was Emma Mashinini, who was a trade unionist of immense repute. She's highly respected in a field that was predominantly male. She was also an author. Strikes Have Followed Me All My Life was her most well-known book. As you can see, the sign behind her, A Government Without Justice, is a little more than a group of bandits. Is kind of, I think that's pretty universal and timeless. The other woman on the board was Leah Tutu, who is the wife of Desmond Tutu, but an activist in her own right. I love the body language there. I mean, she's a strong woman. And there, Desmond Tutu looks kind of little next to her, and she's like, don't mess with me. She's an amazing woman, amazing woman. So these women were role models for their remarkable journey of strength and tenacity in a turbulent environment underpinned by patriarchal traditions. Although, as the earlier DVD mentioned, by the time of the new constitution, there was such a strong awareness of the social justice issues that constitution was one of the most progressive in the world, if not the most progressive in the world, including the rights of women, the rights of sexual choice, the rights, even the right of health care, that everybody had a right to health care. Whether it can be delivered economically is another matter, but it is, these ideas have been enshrined in that constitution. Now, I don't know if other countries have come up with something that tops it, but I still think, I suspect it's still the high water mark for a kind of enlightened constitution. So, onward. This is the Bag Factory Studios. I was co-founder and executive director of this project. It offered lifelong learning, studios, workshops for specifically creating a melting pot situation where black artists and white artists could work side by side. It was targeting specifically black artists, but was put in a suburb on the edge of the downtown of Johannesburg where both communities could come together. So I secured the property, raised all the major financing, established its nonprofit status, and went through all the hoops that were required for establishing a new organization. And the idea was to bring together artists from different racial, cultural, and educational backgrounds. It's become something of an example in that environment of inclusivity and diversity, and actually won a Best Practices Award some years back. Extremely successful, operating globally. It has an artist in residence program, and artists come from Britain, from Europe, from other parts of the world to spend 2-3 months or whatever at the Bag Factory Studios. It has a place where you exhibit, and it spills out onto the street, and it's an amazing opportunity for Western artists to go and experience the vivacity of that culture there. So still in Johannesburg, just very quickly, the Federated Union of Black Artists managed a high-profile tour of the 5 major South African cities of a significant collection of artwork. This was put together by Anthony Cara, who you may know is one of Britain's preeminent public sculptors. And he had artists from kind of top-level artists from America, from Britain, donate to this collection that went out to be a learning tool and also an advocacy tool, specifically for the black community. And I was brought in to manage that process on the South African side under the umbrella of the Federated Union of Black Artists. Again, involved in securing funding, seeing it through its tour of 5 centers. A shout out to BMW, who have a very progressive and globally recognized arts program, and they fund these kinds of projects. They were the major funder of this particular one. And they went on to fund other progressive initiatives in the Southern African subcontinent. Still in Johannesburg, I was national coordinator of an annual International Writers' Conference, which was promoting democratic literary arts in South Africa. It was run by the largest newspaper affiliated with The Guardian in England. It was a kind of fairly high visibility ideas forum that had some impact at the time. And finally, just one other project, also co-founded with my husband at the time, Newtown Galleries. This was on the Newtown Cultural Precinct, which you see there with the Market Theatre, Kippie's Jazz Club, the Yard of Ale pub, and this was a kind of a clustering through the late 80s and 90s, where a lot of progressive initiatives took place. It was an amazing atmosphere. It was during the end of apartheid, the first elections, and the amazing political optimism that was around at the time. It operated politically and strategically with a Pan-African agenda. So we're bringing in artists from from the rest of the continent. And it somewhat led the way for museums at the time. It was seen in the press as leading the way for museums at the time in terms of representing the kind of more isolated sectors of the community, the Black community particularly. And it operated through the political transitions that you were seeing earlier. So there were other projects too, but that's just a kind of thumbnail. As you can see, most of my work has been in the arts for their transformational impact on communities. I've kind of felt always driven by social justice issues right from the get-go. But translated it into the kind of impact that the arts can have, because the arts bypass the rational mind and they become an instinctive understandings about things. So they communicate in a way that can have a great impact on people individually and communities as a whole. And that is kind of the point that I'll be coming to through this. So just as a bit of background, in Rhodesia, where I was raised, the fight in Rhodesia for independence was a military fight. All boys, when they graduated from school, had to spend 9 months on the border, and it was called the Boys on the Border program. This had a crippling effect on the economy. The fight on the border was vicious, the guerrilla war. It was real war. You know, this wasn't playing, practicing for being soldiers. And these were kids, 18-year-olds, straight from school. So it affected the morale of the people, it affected the economy, and eventually, as you know, the regime there declared UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, from Britain, but it failed. It was always doomed to fail. In South Africa, the armed resistance was less effective. There were a few bombs on some railway lines. There was one at the Johannesburg station that had one casualty. And there were odd little spats here and there, but the guerrilla army of the ANC, which is called Inkonte Wesizwe, meaning the spear of the nation, they weren't as effective. They had lots of camps outside in Mozambique and Uganda and so on where they were training, but somehow didn't roll out, fortunately, perhaps, didn't roll out into effective action in the streets of Johannesburg, or, you know, affecting in the same way it affected in Rhodesia. So the war was fought more in the minds of people, and this is why one of the greatest influences came through the arts. And I'll give you an example. In 1976, the government declared that all Black Bantu education must be taught in Afrikaans. And you saw in the earlier DVD how important the education system, and the complaint is now that there still isn't enough schools for all the children. Well, back then, it was even more so. You would have 70, 80 children in a class with a teacher that is simply a few steps ahead of the children. Were not necessarily qualified teachers. So there were two educational systems, one for the Black community and one for the white community. And the resources were going to the white community, totally disproportionate in comparison to the Black community. So the students knew that they would never be competitive based on their education. But it was taught in English, and that was okay because they understood that English was the international language, it was the language of commerce and trade and so on. So even if you was Ndebele or Sotho or Zulu or Xhosa, you'd still feel education needs to be in English, even though it would be sometimes it's the third or fourth language that the kids would speak. But Afrikaans was an unknown language. Suddenly, from one day to the next, all the education had to be in Afrikaans, not just learning Afrikaans, but Afrikaans was to be the medium of education. So this was, for one thing, it's the language of the oppressor, so there's this emotional impact that has. But it was designed to subjugate people's identity and to ensure that they would fail. So the students across the country were outraged. On June 16, 1976, it all erupted in Soweto, which is the township just outside Johannesburg. An unarmed crowd of schoolchildren marched towards the soccer stadium where a peaceful rally had been planned. The crowd swelled to approximately 10,000 students. They were excited. You can see the smiles, they're singing. It's a bit like a carnival. None of the students had weapons of any sort other than the potential to pick up a stone off the side of the road and throw it. But they were unarmed. En route to the stadium, approximately 50 policemen stopped the students and tried to turn them back. At first, the security forces tried tear gas and warning shots, but the students just kept on singing. And one of the points was what they were singing. The anthem for the ANC was Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, which means God bless Africa. It's now the national anthem of South Africa. But back then it was banned because it was the song of the ANC, and the ANC was banned, so by extension the song was banned. And they were singing, and despite the policemen's attempts to turn them back, they just kept on singing. So eventually the policeman snapped and fired directly into the crowd of students. These actions produced an image that exploded in the minds of the people in the streets, in the white suburbs, in the corporate offices of the leaders of business, and most especially abroad. And this is the image. You may be familiar with this image. You may have seen it. Time magazine has listed this image in their 100 most influential images of all time. This is one of them. Time magazine has a ranking thing. So in this picture, you see Mboyisa Makuba as a lanky 18-year-old high school pupil in dungarees. He was pictured in photojournalist Sam Nzima's photograph. In the photo, he's holding the dying Hector Pieterson, who's a 12-year-old, and running alongside is Pieterson's sister, Antoinette Pieterson. This is now Antoinette Sithole. The anguish on the teenage faces was soon published all over the world, turning all three into accidental heroes. All four, in fact, including the photographer. And there's a story to each of these, which if I have time at the end, I'll come back to. I don't want to go too much off course. So the photograph of Hector Pieterson became emblematic of the brutal regime of Afrikaner nationalism. Already the very next day, newspapers across the world published this image on their front pages. It shocked the international community into paying attention and totally hardened their attitudes to Afrikaner nationalism. And in South Africa, by the next day, the protests began to spread, and soon the townships throughout the country erupted. More South African security forces, equipped with armored tanks and live ammunition, poured into the townships. Their instructions were shoot to kill for the sake of law and order. It didn't matter who they were shooting, unarmed children, but the important thing was to reestablish law and order. The police claimed that approximately 600 deaths happened through this series of uprisings, but subsequent counts tracked over 3,000. And you can see the signs is Afrikaans, sorry. Afrikaans must be abolished. And here again, this is released detainees. But you'll see signs that the objection was about Afrikaans, the teaching of Afrikaans. It was just that last straw that kind of set the whole situation aflame. So as the riots continued, the image of Hector Pieterson became the symbol of the struggle and was recognized as a watershed moment even by the previous generation of activists. They were incarcerated on Robben Island since about the mid-60s. I think 1964 was the Rhodesia trials, and you saw them, Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki's father, Governor Mbeki, name slipped me for a moment, Oliver Tambo. There was a large group of people who were incarcerated, or they were the leadership of the ANC through the early 60s. And by 1964, they were pretty much all incarcerated on Robben Island. So very little had happened in terms of their activism against apartheid during the rest of the 60s and into the 70s. But even those in their memoirs after the fact, those on Robben Island suddenly saw the youth uprising as a watershed moment for the struggle to continue, for the next generation to pick up the baton and push forwards with the resistance. So the politicization and the activism of the students in Soweto and beyond galvanized the liberation movements and set in motion a series of transformations that ultimately led to the demise of apartheid. That image continued to be persistent and insidious irritant in the side of apartheid. It would never go away, and it lives to this day. In 2002, in the place of this tragedy, the Hector Pieterson Museum was opened to commemorate the students of the Soweto uprising. And that is, and this is the museum. These look like leaves. Those look like, sorry. Those look like leaves. They're actually little tiles with the names of the students who died in Soweto. There were students who died in protests all around the country, but this is specifically for that place, that area of Soweto. And they are the names of those that they've tracked, anyway, that passed during the Soweto uprising. That image again is a centerpiece. This is the outside section, and it says unveiled by Dr. Nelson, and his middle name is Rolihlahla Mandela, on June 16, 1992. So that's when they erected the museum and unveiled this as a commemoration piece outside. And it's interesting, again, that the impact of images, those little stones were all they had for ammunition. And the wall behind, the structure of the thing is all those layers of stone. Is a kind of interesting. Hector Pieterson's sister, Antoinette, works there now. She's a tour guide. She tells her story. She's now in her 60s. So such is the power of art. Powerful images, as I said earlier, bypass the rational mind and impact our sense of the world, the shape of who we are, and the moral choices we make. And in that situation, what does an individual do? You have to work really hard if you want to be neutral, because we have emotions, we're empathetic. So the natural instinct is to have an empathetic reaction. Aristotle claimed that the aim of art is to represent not the outward experience of things, but the inward significance. This process has transformative power for each of us, helping us to become more thoughtful and mindful of others. Imagery reflects the world we live in, its joys, its sorrows, its beauty, its trials. In similar fashion, the arts are transformative on whole communities, whole countries. This understanding was well leveraged by those who wanted to direct or control the way people think. A good example is the English Reformation, which was from the 1500s through to the mid-1600s. During this period saw the obliteration of the art and architecture of that period because the leaders of the Reformation wanted to usher in a new era with new heroes, if you like. It was imperative to them that the imagery of the old era had to be destroyed, or they would never get control of the minds in order to redirect the civilization, the community's heroes, the community's values. So such is the impact of images. There's another image I'd like to share with you today. Am I doing all right for time?
Yes, you're fine.
Yeah, okay. This is one you might call performance, and some people did consider it performance, although it was many-layered. Nelson Mandela was finally released in 1990. In 1995, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, they called it, was formed and was spearheaded by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It was held around the country. It would be broadcast weekly on national television. The victims came forward to tell their stories, but most importantly, the perpetrators came forward too, because they were if they came forward and that if they spoke that their crimes were politically motivated, their abuses, if you like, were politically motivated, that they were proportionate, and that they gave full disclosure. The commission was empowered to grant them amnesty. So a lot of the perpetrators did come forwards, and it was harrowing for the commission to sit through these, and for the audiences to sit through it. I think it was on, as I recall, it was every Sunday afternoon. They would broadcast the hearings from that week. And hear what was done to people, and then hear the victims come forward, talk about what was done to them and their loved ones who disappeared during this period. So through this process, the nation witnessed itself in all its horrors. In the end, approximately 7,000 individuals applied for amnesty, but only 10% actually got it. And one of the challenges of that is that they had to give full disclosure. And of course, the more they say of what they did, the harder it becomes to forgive. So it's kind of like, it's difficult. In the middle of the TRC panel was Desmond Tutu, occasionally weeping with the horror of everything he was being witness to. And he would weep openly. And in a way, he was weeping for everybody. It was as though he was carrying the sins of that period of time, like the sacrificial goat, so that he cleanses it for everybody else, was the kind of subliminal message that was sent out through this process, that he was kind of carrying it for everybody. And he would break down. I don't remember the specific words or the many, many stories the details of the stories that were shared during those hearings, but what I do remember is, if I saw it yesterday, was an image. It was one of those moments where Desmond Tutu became emotionally overwhelmed. It was after a particular harrowing testimony, and there was a silence. Complete silence. You could hear nothing. Complete silence from both the spectators, from the panel. Then slowly he dropped his head until his forehead hit the table in front of him. And he just stayed like that, and nobody moved. And it was a frozen moment. His head bent, shoulders hunched, and this just so much the weight of all that had gone on, the weight of the past, the weight of the abuse, the weight of the sorrow, the weight of the iniquities that had been perpetrated. You'd see him like this a lot. This is not the moment, but it's the closest I could find. In fact, I don't know if anyone quite captured that moment, be it in painting, sculpture, or photograph, or in whatever form. But for me, it was unforgettable. It stood for the catharsis on the way to forgiveness. So how much of this can you take and then forgive? So what does one do in these circumstances? Well, that is always such a subjective question. And I come from the arts. So for me, it's like you stand the truth of where you stand, and you do what you do from that place where you stand. For me, to make art is to capture for all time what Aristotle refers to as that inner significance. How we express ourselves in one existential moment, the authentic reflection of ourselves in transformation. And in this way, art becomes memory. It's the heritage of tomorrow. You think what we look at when we try to understand where we've come from. It's embedded in the psyche and is built upon through evolution. Thank you. So I'm open to questions. I could go on a little bit about Sam and Zima. Do you want me to just elaborate a little bit? There was the picture of the three and the photographer. Do I have time just to come back to that? Okay. Okay, all right, okay. We got time, yay. Okay, so back to that picture. I don't know if I can easily jump back to it, but I'm sure you've all got it fairly indelibly in your mind. Huh? The arrows. On your keyboard. It means flicking all the way back. Shall I do that? Well, there it is. There it is. Okay, so in that picture, there in a sense are three victims, and the photographer is the fourth. The Pieterson family, obviously the loss is clear, and Antoinette Pieterson is the sister of the dying Hector Pieterson. But the Pieterson family weren't the only ones who suffered through this moment that was captured by the photographer. The Makuba family, Mboyisa's family, Mboyisa Makuba, he was acting from a kindness and impulsiveness. He wasn't even part of the protests, but they lived a block away, and he heard the shooting. And apparently his mother said, he jumped up and he said, "Ma, they're killing the kids. I've got to go and help." And he jumped over their fence and he ran off. As he got there, he saw Hector Pieterson fall, and he went and scooped him up and ran to a few blocks to where somebody he knew had a car to get him to the hospital. By the time they got to the car, Hector Pieterson had actually passed. But he was deeply scarred by the whole thing. His family was already being watched by the apartheid police, because they were friends of the Mandelas and the other family, Sisulu's, Walter Sisulu's family, who were Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela were both, Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela were both on Robben Island, but Makuba's family, the Makuba family was friends with their family. And so they had been watching. His father had already gone into exile. His sister reported that, actually I have a quote from his sister, from Mboyisa's sister. She said, "I was very close to my brother. After that day, when he had carried the boy, he was disturbed and distressed. He was harassed all the time by police and journalists. Eventually he said, 'I have to go.' And I packed him a small bag and he left for the border, to Botswana. He wrote for a while, but after 5 years, the letter stopped. We never saw him again." There have been some reports that he's been found in a mental institution in Canada, and it's a very complicated story. A delegation went out to try and establish whether this was Mbuyisa. And this person is mentally unsound, but was talking about certain episodes in his life that they started piecing together. And there's so much potential for corruption in many of these situations. And the delegation that was given funds to go and help resolve this, there seemed to be some corruption involved, and the funds disappeared, and they went back in some kind of disarray and uncertainty. So I don't know what's happened since then in establishing whether this is actually Mbuyisa. He's no doubt quite an old man at this stage. So that's Mbuyisa. There as a 18-year-old in dungarees. In a way, Hector Pieterson is immortalized. There will always be a Hector Pieterson museum. It will always be seen, his death will always be seen as the turning point in the demise, in the resistance to apartheid. The other person is Sam Nzima, the photographer, who I do have a photograph of him. Just give me a moment. Oh, that's something else I can talk about. That's Sam Nzima, who's is somewhat of a hero in more recent time. He actually passed away in May this year. I just realized that the other day. But he was a very promising photographer with the World magazine, based in Johannesburg. It was a magazine primarily for black circulation. And he was a young photographer when this happened. He was hounded out of Johannesburg. He had come from a village called Lilydale, up in northern Transvaal, northern provinces of South Africa. And so he went back to his ancestral village, and there he's lived out the rest of his life. He was told by the local police if they ever saw him with his camera, he would be arrested. He was arrested and detained. In that environment, you could be arrested and detained without charge for up to, I think it was up to 6 months, and then you can just apply for another 6 months and so on. So he spent some time in detention, and he was let go but told, if we ever see you with your camera, you'll be detained indefinitely. So he never did, and he put it away, but then, of course, the tide eventually turned, and subsequently he was sort of resuscitated. I think even after the end of apartheid, one of the major newspapers offered him a position to come back and be a photographer again, but he was so traumatized by the whole thing that he wouldn't leave his village. He said, no, they'll get me, they'll get me somehow. And so he did live out his years there, but he then became, you can see his picture, the picture is on the wall. And he entertained a lot of visitors, and overseas people would come and speak with him about his experiences as a photographer in those days. So that's where Sam Nzima is. No life is left unchanged by these events. They are a remarkable event. There is no neutral ground. There's one other thing I could refer to before we go to questions, is this is a bit of what you're seeing today. The expectations were so high that they could not be met. At the time, the alternate party for the black community was called the PAC, the Pan-African Congress. They were much more radical, and they were all in favor of, just take the land and so on, a bit like what they did in Zimbabwe. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was trying to find that ground to bridge these things. And one of the criticisms was, well, it got a lot of truth, and there's no doubt about that, but where's the reconciliation? You can get the truth, but does truth then make reconciliation even more difficult? That was the problem of 7,000 applying for amnesty, but actually they only gave it to 10%, is that the more truth you have, the greater the chasm. So that was a kind of commentary at the time on that's why some people would refer to it as performance, that they felt it had a symbolic meaning, it had a symbolic impact, but did it really create reconciliation? So, questions? Yeah, I think. Thanks.
I was in China during the Tiananmen demonstrations, and I'm wondering, in South Africa, what motivated these children to demonstrate, and what is it they were asking for that proved so fearsome to the government?
They were asking for an education. They were asking to be taught in English and for an investment in their education and therefore in their future. That's all. That was all. That was all they wanted. You saw the signs in the protests, as down with Afrikaans, and that's all they wanted. That's what triggered it, was the idea that they were going to have to learn in Afrikaans. Not just learn Afrikaans, but learn in Afrikaans.
This is Wayne. You familiar with the street artist Faith 47 from South Africa? No.
Faith 47, I don't know
her true name. But
yeah.
How is street art there? Do they have a lot of political street art?
Well, obviously during apartheid they didn't, but yes, and there was an interesting view of what role art plays. To the more radical, the only art that really had meaning was political art. It was protest art, that you had to do protest art. And somehow to that sector of the community, art as we know it would be a luxury, an indulgence in such a turbulent environment, that just to make art for your own expression. Of course, we understand that art's an expression of a time and a sensibility and a condition, human condition under certain circumstances. So that obviously any art you make at any time is going to have a deeper significance than just the expression of one person. But yes, there were kind of interesting nuances to it all. As a young white woman in that environment, doing the things I was doing, one of the ideas that was totally ingrained in that environment is that, what are you doing this for? One of the charges that would come from the PAC or the BC Black Consciousness movement is that white people who take on the struggle are simply empire building on other people's struggle. That they're creating a place for themselves in society through the struggle of others. Because at the end of the day, we do go back to our houses. We don't live in shanties. So that was something that you had to be very aware of, and the ANC was considered itself non-racial, so it didn't have that. But you know, there's always a pulls and pushes in an environment, and the more radical side would say, you know, these young white people, this isn't your struggle. What are you doing on our territory? This is our struggle. So you lived with that, and I guess for me the learning from that was that we never own what we do. That as non-profit leaders, as non-profit workers, the community owns what we do. It's not ours. We just have the privilege of carrying the baton for a period of time before we pass it to somebody else. But it's not ours. It's the community's.
Excuse me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to know, was this, during this period, was there also a dispute about relocation? I mean, large farms, which a lot of the white people owned, huge farming areas, how the land should be distributed after apartheid.
After independence, you mean?
Yeah,
after the thing.
Right.
In Zimbabwe, you know, they did take land without compensation, and it was disastrous for the economy, and a lot of the famine and the death and the poverty has come because the agricultural industry, the tobacco industry was a big one there, the sugar, because that all collapsed. And the farms weren't given to people who would go and farm and make a success. They were given to political cronies. They were given to people to get favor, to make sure that you stayed in power. In South Africa, that hasn't happened. And part of the pressure on Cyril Ramaphosa is, what is he going to do about this? The fact that the most of the farms are still in white hands. And I did read something some months back when he was first sworn in, that he was under pressure from some groups to take land from whites and to redistribute. And we can only hope that some lessons have been learned from what happened in Zimbabwe and how badly the economy of the country crashed. When Zimbabwe became independent, it didn't have $1 of debt, not one. During those UDI years, everybody made everything, and there was the slogan, make your own mayonnaise. And we all bought from, you'd buy local. You'd buy mayonnaise that was made in the town one down. And so to see how crushed it is economically is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. So we can only hope that South Africa won't do it that way. They do have to face the problem of the redistribution of land. How they're going to do it, I don't know. Cyril Ramaphosa was actually a trade union leader. He was immensely powerful during that transition, as he was the head of the COSATU, which was the main trade union, the mine workers trade union. Immensely influential. And he has the business background. And in fact, there was, before Thabo Mbeki became the vice president, there was a tussle of who was going to be either Cyril Ramaphosa or Thabo Mbeki. And Thabo Mbeki is an economist. He was educated abroad. He was out of the country most of the time during his younger years. And so I guess that was his choice. But Cyril Ramaphosa, if I remember correctly, water affairs was his first portfolio in the new government. But he was always acknowledged by Nelson Mandela as a potential politician. He was the younger of the two. But yes, he's going to have to face that. There's what to do about that.
Thank you so much.
I think there was a question.
Is there?
Cassia, did you? Cassia had a question for, I saw her hand was up.
I think they call time, Sandra, but thank you so much for a wonderful look from somebody who's very familiar with it.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thank you all.